Welcome to Commander Central, episode 295, and today we'll be taking a look at a listener, Justin Calusi Esta's Mavinda Students Advocate Combat Tricks deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Hey, Max, how you doing today?
Pretty good. It's Tuesday, because it's the week of American Thanksgiving, so we're recording pretty early this week.
Yes, we are, and I think last week we had said, because Chris wasn't here because he was sick, and I wasn't the week before, so we'll be back together next week, and then we forgot that Chris was gone hunting this week, so it is just us again.
Oh well, we'll make do without him.
I'm assuming he's out there, like, just a knife in hand, stalking some
Rambo
kind of
style.
John Wick style.
Ooh.
Not sure if that's true, but that's what I'm going to picture anyway.
You know what? I like that. I'll picture that as well.
Got any fun Thanksgiving plans coming up?
Not really. You know, my dad's working over the week, so I just plan on chilling at home. Might hang out with my roommate's family. Haven't really made up my mind yet.
It's pretty low-key here, too. I'm going to go to my mom's, I think, Thanksgiving Day, and then we'll run over to my wife's family's house on the day after Thanksgiving for Thanksgiving there. So I get 2 turkey dinners, so I'm okay with all of that as well. Plenty of leftovers and on top of it.
Very nice.
Yeah, and then I'll enjoy my full weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and then back to the grind for a week. And then you and I are taking a trip to Vegas on the week after that, so we'll have to probably record a show or 2 ahead of time to get ready for that.
Yeah, we will definitely figure that out.
Looking forward to it. And speaking of Vegas, so we're recording this the week after the kind of Vegas Grand Prix-ish event went down that we did not go to because we had already planned this trip, and the timing was kind of wonky, at least for me. I didn't want to make this trip and then not have time to quarantine before I saw family and stuff. So whereas like the trip we're taking in early December, I've got 2 weeks baked in afterwards where I can just not leave the house to make sure I'm not going to bring COVID to some family members on Christmas. But if anyone was wondering why we didn't wind up going to that event in Vegas while we're going to Vegas a couple weeks later, that was primarily it for me. I didn't have the ability to make that trip and then quarantine in a way that I was comfortable with afterwards before seeing like grandparents and stuff. I was not in a position to do that, so I didn't go. But it seemed like it went off pretty well, and all the pictures I saw, everyone was masked up and having a good time. So I think that bodes well for events in the coming year in 2022, I think. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, hopefully we get those announcements for events towards the end of the year so we can start making plans accordingly.
Yeah, because I think we just last week started getting some stuff for like Pro Tour kind of things for next year. So hopefully then other events schedule will follow shortly thereafter. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Did you get any games in this week, or is your zombie deck still languishing untested?
My zombie deck is languishing untested. It might just get its first reps in Vegas.
Nice. Okay. All right. I didn't get a chance to play much. I'm actually going to go to the shop tonight, I think, Tuesday night, and play. So hopefully I'll get some games in there. I do have a deck that I just ordered cards for that I'm going to put together. It will be ready for when we make our trip, but I'm not sure I'll have it done before then. But I did put together a mono-red Anax Hardened in the Forge deck.
Awesome.
With no instants or sorceries. It is an all permanence deck. And I haven't entirely figured out yet if I'm going to make it. One of the requirements I was going to do was every red card in it had to have at least 2 red pips in the casting cost. I'm not sure if I'm going to stick to that entirely. Just because if I'm going all permanence, I'm kind of limited to having to use things like Ingot Chewer to destroy artifacts and stuff, since I'm not using instant or sorcery spells. And for whatever reason, most of the red creatures that have the option to destroy an artifact don't have multiple pips in the cost. So I'm like, I don't want to be in. I think I'm already restricting myself enough by not running instant and sorceries that I don't know how much further I need to lock things down. So I don't think I'm going to go that far with it. But yeah, I am going to try to build a deck with no instants or sorceries, and that's going to be the one.
In mono red, that's extremely interesting because like that's where you get a lot of your draw and stuff.
Yes.
And your removal. So like, are you just running every single impulse enchantment that you can get your hands on?
Yes. Almost any permanent, be it. I mean, because there are a few, there's like, the Outpost Siege kind of effects. But yeah, any of the creatures that have like an impulse draw kind of thing on it, I've got everything jammed in there. Or things like Stolen Strategy or...
A couple Chandras do that, don't it?
Yes, there's a couple of those as well. So that's That's the only draw basically I'm going to have. And part of the reason I went with this was I have an old card that I picked up called Raging River. And it's a red enchantment that didn't get printed after Unlimited. It's double red pips. And basically it just says when you attack, you divide all of your creatures into like 2 groups. And your opponents divide their creatures into 2 groups, and like I can then pick and choose like, okay, well, this group blocks this one and this group blocks this one, and then they have to then decide their blocks from that point on. So I can just verify that. I can just basically make like sure that this group of creatures doesn't have to get blocked by this group of things, and vice versa. I can make it more difficult to assign good blocks. And it's not a particularly amazing card, and it probably is just time-consuming and annoying. But it's also like double red pips to cast, and my commander is going to be pretty big in that deck, so I think having advantageous blocks is useful. So it's just like an excuse to be able to run that stupid Raging River card to a degree, too.
This is a very weird card, and I'm kind of dumbfounded by it, so I can't wait to see it in action.
Yes, this is exactly the reason I built decks, is to play stupid cards that people... It's one of those cards people are going to read like, that's not a real card, that's made up. Like, all the cards are made up.
I do that with half the cards that get printed today. No, that doesn't sound
true.
Real.
I actually kind of did that with the deck we're looking at here today. I was like, Mavinda, that's not a real card. I don't think that's a real thing. So if you out there in listener land have built anything cool or want to talk about some made-up cards that you've seen that don't seem real to you, that are in fact real, how'd you go about doing that, Chris?
Wow.
How'd you go about doing that, Max?
You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all by searching CMDR Central. You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central and check out our reward tiers, such as a Decks You Play show like this, or joining our community to chat with us and play virtual EDH. And this week we want to say hello to one new patron, and that would be C. Brian. So thank you, C. Brian, for supporting us and joining the community.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to our patron supporters, and thanks to everyone out there who supports us, whether it's by liking or retweeting the show when we release a new one, or just listening and upvoting. It all means a lot, so thank you all very, very much. And I think we have a couple of contests fired off this month, Max.
Yeah, we have our end of the year contest going on for our Patreon supporters. So if you support us now or in December, but as long as you support us through the end of the year, you will be entered into win one of 3 prizes. The first being a sealed Plane Chase anthology. I'm pretty sure that's what it is that Chris said a couple weeks back. A sealed From the Vault Transformed, and a Urza's Saga Grim Monolith, donated by patron and listener of the show, Matthias.
That is crazy. That's insane. All 3 of those are insane, and it gets progressively more insane as you announce each of them.
I know. We need to find something to slot in between the From the Vault and the Grim, I think.
Right, yeah. So thank you very much to Matthias for providing that to us, and thanks to you and Chris, and thanks to everyone out there. So this is a pretty nice way to wrap up the year. I'm looking forward to giving those away. All right, should we jump into taking a look at this deck here?
Yeah, let's totally do it.
Okay, so Justin writes, wow, I'm excited. I've been debating which deck, but I settled on my mono-white Mavinda deck. Out of reference to y'all's expressed opinions, I will not have you discuss my Mutate deck. Well, thank you very much. But thank you very much, Justin. We really do appreciate that, myself especially. He says, my meta, there's just a few in my playgroup. We're split between very good long-time players who either pilot precons to see how far they can push them, or play decks that are just weird experiments, or they have strong pet decks that are hobbled so as to not be crushing. They tend to win through combat and avoid infinite combos. And he said, then there's me. I like to take a strange commander or a weird concept and see if I can make it viable. This deck has been successful, but I can't tell if that's because it's been underestimated or if it can actually be strengthened to hang in with decks in the 6 to 8 range. The goal of the deck is to do a very white thing, which is to gain value through combat tricks and weenies, and a very non-white thing, which is to gain value through repeated use of instants and sorceries. The finishers are typically back-to-back turns casting Launch the Fleet to go wide, then wider, and with one of the massive buffs on the second attack to punch through. Alternatively, he likes to buff a single creature with counters and give it evasion, and he's avoided making this a blink deck because he's one of those hipsters that doesn't want to do what everyone else is doing, which I totally get.
What should we focus on? He wasn't sure because of the pandemic. He hasn't been able to used this deck outside of his playgroup, so he's not really sure if it works for real. It's a finicky, tense deck to play because it's all about timing and conserving your plays until absolutely necessary. It's probably weakest to non-combat interaction. Budget-wise, he said he would like to keep it around $20 to $25 on a card. There are cards that he does have, such as Smothering Tithe, but have been pulled because they are kill-on-sight cards, and he has swapped them out for something like Monologue Tax.
And his final note here is say thank you, and he knows this is more than what people usually say with their decks, but he wanted to give us an idea of what he's looking for. But he wants to thank us in general for just being a fun and interesting show. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. Thanks for the support, and thanks for the thanks. All right, Mavinda, Student's Advocate. For those that don't know, it's one of the 160 commanders released this year, and I'm not exaggerating. Mavinda Student's Advocate is 2 and a white for a legendary creature, Bird Advisor. Mavinda is a 2/3 with flying, and it has an activated ability for 0 mana that says, you may cast target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard this turn. If that spell does not target a creature you control, it costs 8 more to cast this way. And if that spell we put into your graveyard, exile it instead. Activate this only once each turn, and you still have to pay attention to timing rules for that spell. So if you have a spell in your graveyard that, let's say Swords to Plowshares, and if you want to use it on your own creature, you can just cast it and it just costs a single white. If you choose to use that Swords to Plowshares on one of your opponent's creatures, it's going to cost 8 and a white. So primarily you're trying to reuse spells to target your own creatures to be able to cast them for their normal casting cost functionally. And that's really it. It's a mythic, but there's a lot of text on there, but it's a pretty straightforward card for the most part.
For sure.
So what does he have here for lands, Max?
There are 33 lands, and there are also 2 MDFCs throughout the rest of the deck. So that brings it up to 35. The 33 lands in the land slot here are Desert of the True, Drifting Meadow, Secluded Steep, so those are all the cycling lands, 28 Plains, the Biblioplex, and War Room. And I will quickly read the Biblioplex because I didn't know what it did. This is from Strixhaven. It taps to add a colorless, and then you can pay 2 and tap it to look at the top card of your library. If it's an instant or sorcery card, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. If you don't put the card into your hand, you may put it into your graveyard. Activate only if you have exactly 0 or 7 cards in hand.
So what do you think of the land spread that he has here? Let's start with the Biblioplex. It's not going to trigger, you're not going to be able to use it very often. Having to have exactly 0 or 7 cards in hand just doesn't come up that often. Maybe some decks you can have 7 very frequently, or maybe you're playing a Madness deck and you frequently don't have any. But on average, that's just not something that's going to come up very often. I don't think this is a deck where it's going to come up very often. On the other hand, you're not really losing very much either. This isn't a deck running like a bunch of Extraplanar Lens or a Gauntlet of Power or Cage Sun kind of effects that matter specifically if you have planes. So you can get away with utility lands in this deck and it's just never going to hurt you really. And, on occasion, you're going to be in the place where you can use it. There's no downside to it. I would just guess it doesn't have much upside very often either.
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially, it doesn't feel like we're going to be drawing a lot of cards all the time here.
Right.
There isn't even a Reliquary Tower in this deck because we're going to be utilizing our graveyard. So I think there are definitely better cards to be running instead of the Biblioplex.
Yeah, it's not bad. I just don't think it gets the job. It's not going to work very often. I don't know if I would even pull it out necessarily because it does come into play untapped. There's just not much downside. I'm going to guess it doesn't work very often either.
Yeah.
So the first thing I will point out is I don't like cycling lands. There's Desert of the True, Drifting Meadow, and Secluded Steep in here, so there's 3 of them. And I guess I shouldn't say I don't like cycling lands. I don't like cycling lands unless you have some extra way to take advantage of cycling. As it stands right now in this deck, there isn't. So primarily what these lands are is planes that come into play tapped, and as a trade-off for that tempo hit, if you happen to draw one of these on turn 9 or something and you already have 2 planes in hand, you can cycle it to draw a card. I don't know if that's a worthwhile trade-off. I think if you are playing in a deck that can cast things from your graveyard or cast lands, particularly from your graveyard or play lands, then maybe it's worth the trade-off because there's not much downside. You're going to pitch it, draw a card, and then replay it anyway with your Crucible Worlds or your Excavator or something. But this deck isn't running those. Or there's decks that have a bunch of Delve spells or something. I'm going to pitch this land to draw my card, and it's going to fuel my Delve to make it easier to do whatever thing I'm delving from my graveyard. There's plenty of decks that do take advantage of that cycling. I don't think this is one, based on all the cards in it, As a result, I just don't think the tempo hit of playing those lands tapped makes up for the once in a while you're going to want to pitch them and draw a card. Do you agree with that, Max, or do you have a different take on that?
I 100% agree with that. I'm kind of in the same boat you are, unless you are paying it off, whether through playing extra lands every turn or getting value from cycling like some of the Jeskai commanders do from from like the Ixalan sets. I don't really like running them, but they are a great budget option, and if this is one of those decks that maybe can compete with the pre-con type decks in his playgroup, maybe that's fine then, but I would remove them if this is my deck.
If I was concerned about budget, even like at that point, I would just rather have 3 planes in those slots and have them every single time come into play untapped. I think that is going to be relevant to my game plan more often than having the option to cycle them later in the game. Now, that being said, I don't know if we should just not run them and put planes in the deck either, because this is a deck that can afford to run utility lands. So what I would do in those slots, or just in general, number one, I would run a couple of land removal lands. We always kind of beat this drum. But I mean, if you're playing against a mono black deck and they drop a Cabal Coffers, you're going to lose. If you're playing against, like if you're planning on killing people with combat damage and somebody has a Maze of Ith out, having land removal lands is just going to keep you from losing the game. Maybe it's never going to win you a game, but like it's going to keep you from losing in plenty of situations. I would just find room for a Ghost Quarter and a Tectonic Edge at least. Maybe Field of Ruin or something too, but like you can very easily put 50-cent land removal lands in here that come into play untapped, that will never hurt you, and once every 20 games you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're like, oh, I'm going to save myself right now because that person has a Maze of Ith and it's going to otherwise keep me from killing them, and now I can get rid of it. Or that person has a Rogue's Passage of their own and they're going to swing and hit me with that Blightsteel Colossus, and I can prevent that by blowing up that Rogue's Passage, and now I still have blockers to deal with the Blightsteel. They're just going to save you sometimes, and in a deck like this where you have a room for them, I would just slot a couple of them in.
That totally makes sense to me. A few things I would suggest would be Gyre Reach Sanitarium. This is the one where you can pay 2 to tap it and everybody draws and discards a card. It's essentially doing the same thing that the Biblioplex is doing, but it doesn't have the clause of 0 or 7 cards in your hand. Yep. Another thing I would do is, since you're kind of doing the white weenie go wide strategy, and there are plenty of creatures in here that make tokens as part of their ability, I would maybe spend a little bit of money and buy a Field of the Dead. This enters tapped, it makes colorless mana, but when it or another land enters the battlefield, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So adding the lands Dana recommended, adding Gyre Reach, and swapping some of these planes out for snow-covered planes, since those are readily available, since Call Time was just 6 months ago, it feels like. It was probably longer, though. You could easily get that Field of the Dead trigger going off quite often.
Yeah, for sure. A couple more utility ones I would consider here, and I don't think you want to run 15 utility lands, but like this deck could very easily run 8 and you would never notice, I think. Homeward Path is going to keep someone from ruining your day by taking your commander, because this deck cares about your commander. Core Haven's really good and it's pretty cheap nowadays too. And since we're talking about draw, I've had pretty good luck with Bonder's Enclave recently. It's a land that taps for a colorless, and you can spend 3 to draw a card, but you can only activate that ability if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. That's going to be a threshold you're going to hit more often than the Biblioplex is going to hit it. Just because you do have some bigger creatures in here, but you also have things that buff your creatures. Like there's just going to be situations where you're going to cast a buff and your commander or something else is going to be over the threshold and you'll better tap it to draw a card. I don't think it's a crazy powerful card in this deck. I think there are some decks where it's better, but it's still pretty decent here. I would consider that one as well.
Nice.
Anything else for lands, Max?
I am good. I'm ready to move on.
All right, let's look at artifacts here. There's only 5 of them in this deck. Primal Amulet, which is one of the flip Ixalan artifacts that turns into a land. On the front side, instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less. Makes a lot of sense in this deck. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you put a charge counter on it. And if there are 4 or more charge counters, you flip it. And then when you flip it, it becomes a land that when you use that land for mana, you copy the spell you cast. So makes a lot of sense here for sure. There's a Skeleton Key. 1 mana gives a creature Skulk when it's equipped, and whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player, you may discard a card, and if you do, draw a card. So card selection is almost always useful. In this case, it's even more so because discarding isn't necessarily the same as it is in some decks because you can just recast those spells. So Skeleton Key is really good. Similarly, Smuggler's Copter, that was just a terror when it was in Standard. But again, this is a deck where like drawing and discarding is less painful because you're going to be able to reuse those cards that you have to discard. Swiftfoot Boots to give your creatures hexproof and haste, and there's no Lightning Greaves here, but because so many of your spells want to target your creatures, Lightning Greaves would shut that off. So it makes sense to run Swifties and not Greaves here. And the last one is Tapestry of Ages. It's a 4-mana artifact, and you can spend 2 to draw a card. And it says activate this ability only if you've cast a non-creature spell this turn. So first thing I will point out, there's almost no ramp here in terms of artifacts. There isn't even a Soul Ring. I personally wouldn't do that. White's tends to be slow enough as it is that like I personally wouldn't run a white deck with no ramp, no artifact ramp in particular, but I'm not going to tell them to change that either. Like clearly that's been a conscious choice when there's no Soul Ring. It's not just like, this isn't a situation where there's a Soul Ring and something else and that's it. And I would say only 3 pieces of ramp doesn't feel like enough. I'd up that. He's clearly just not running any of the typical mana rocks. So it feels weird for me to suggest changing that too, but I should point it out because there just aren't rocks here.
Yeah, no rocks seems odd, but at the same time, a lot of these spells in these decks are a single white or 1 and a white. So, Soul Ring might not do enough, but
sure,
I do find it odd. There's a couple things I'm going to suggest that are cost reducers, but not essentially mana rocks.
Well, it's one of those things, sometimes when you try to make a deck like this, you just don't have enough slots for all the things you would like to be able to do. I think back to my Veil of the Nightclad artifact deck. All the things I want to do in that deck means I don't have room for counterspells. I just don't. I'm playing a blue deck with no counterspells, and it's not because I'm against counterspells. Counterspells are great. I just something had to give, and I chose to just not run counterspells to free up like 5 or 6 slots. Sometimes you just need to make those decisions, and it's easy to say in that case, I'm just going to play no counterspells here, and that's just what it is. And I'm guessing that's the same choice here. Like, Justin just doesn't have enough room to run all the instants he wants to play to make the deck work the way he wants it to work. So something has to give, and he's like, I'm just going to not run ramp. So I'm not going to tell him to change that because I do understand both. It's clearly a conscious decision he's made, and, I kind of respect that kind of thing.
Yeah, same here.
We both had the same note here, Max, on Tapestry of Ages. So since you had yours down first, I'll throw it to you. What are your thoughts on Tapestry of Ages?
I think it's fine, especially because this deck is casting a lot of non-creature spells. I mean, there's 31 instants and 5 sorceries and some artifacts. So, I think it's fine for what the deck is trying to do. I also think Endless Atlas does the same thing, but you just need 3 lands of the same kind, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's half a dozen of one, half a dozen of the other. I would probably run both.
I think on average, if you had to pick one, Endless Atlas is probably more efficient more often than not.
Yeah.
I would say Tome of Legends probably is as well. Given the choice, I think I would run either of those 2 over Tapestry, probably.
I think it all depends on how often he swings with his commander.
Sure.
Because it either gets the counter when it enters or attacks. When Tome enters or your commander enters or attacks. So, if you aren't attacking a lot with your commander and just using it as a spell recursion for something else, maybe Tome isn't the best option.
Right.
But, yeah, I love Tome of Legends. I run it in a lot of my decks, but those decks either are partner decks or commanders I'm swinging with every turn.
Exactly. A couple other ones I'll just throw out there. Archaeomancer's Map is a really good card. It's down to $12-ish. I checked earlier today, so this isn't me doing that thing where I haven't checked on a card's price in 6 months. It's really solid, but it's useful. It's not truly ramp necessarily. It's catch up, but it does make it so you can hit your land drops a little more consistently. I like it a lot, and it's always felt good whenever I've played it. The other one I will point out is Scroll Rack is down to 15 for the Commander Legends version, and the list version is around 17. That's not cheap, but it's cheaper than it was, and this deck already is running land tax. Scroll Rack is pretty good on its own anyway, but if you are playing in a deck that has land tax, when you have them out simultaneously, that's amazing. Particularly in a mono white deck, I feel like if you're already running land tax, I would definitely just find room for a Scroll Rack. The interaction is just so good, and even if you don't have them both out at the same time, it's still a very, very good card. I would just look at some point to try to pick up a Scroll Rack before it goes back up in price. It's just a great card. That's a great interaction. I think you'd be happy to have it here.
Yeah, definitely agree there.
One more I would suggest highly here is Veilstone Amulet. It's a 3-mana artifact, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, creatures you control gain hexproof. So this is a deck where you're running 31 different instants, most of which are things you can cast using Mavinda. And if Veilstone Amulet is out, it just lets you turn almost any of those instants in your graveyard into a way to give your commander or any of your strong creatures hexproof. Sometimes it's going to accidentally happen, and you're going to cast Guided Strike or something to give your creature +1/+0 just to draw the card. And then you're going to, make your swing in combat, and someone's going to be like, oh, I can't deal with that now. I can't remove it because you gave it hexproof earlier. But very often you can just do it in response. There's so many instances here that you're going to have in your hand or in your graveyard that someone goes to remove your commander, and you're like, I'm just going to cast Heal for 1 white mana, draw a card to replace itself. The heal's going to go into your graveyard so you can use it again, and your commander got hexproof and you fizzled the spell. I think it's a fantastic card in decks like this, or I run it in my Talran deck and in my Kedis and Kram deck. When it's out, it is absolutely game-changing, and this is a deck I think where it would be. I would find room for Veilstone Amulet here.
Yeah, I like that card a lot. It was on my list internally of adding as well.
And one more I would consider. I've never actually ran it though, so I'm not sure how good it will wind up being, but there's a piece of equipment called Livewire Lash from back in Scars of Mirrodin. It's 2 mana to cast, 2 to equip. It gives a creature +2/+0, which is useful, but it says whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell, this creature deals 2 damage to target creature or player. So you're going to equip this to whatever thing you're routinely targeting with your spells from Mavinda, and you get a free shock. Whenever you do the thing you were already going to do anyway, Livewire Lash just gives you a free shock functionally. I've never ran it, so maybe it's not worth messing around with, but I could see that potentially being a colossal pain in the butt for your opponents to deal with. That is out, and suddenly you're just like, okay, I'm going to cast this, bandage and this artful maneuver and this, oblation or something, and you've dealt 6 damage to someone's face, or you've taken out their biggest creature for no extra cost other than the cost for you to cast and equip it the first time. So it's just extra gas, I think, and I feel like in this deck that could do a good amount of damage to someone's face or remove difficult creatures as well. So that's one I would at least take a look at.
Yeah.
How about you, Max? Do you have any final ones here?
So I have 2. One would be obviously Emerald Medallion, but that's $15.
Yeah.
That reduces all your white spells by 1 generic mana. But on the cheaper end, we have Oketra's Monument.
Yeah.
White creature spells cost 1 less to cast, and there are 22 creatures in this deck. Along with that, whenever you cast a creature spell, you make a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance. So again, just playing into this go wide theme, you get a cost reduction, and you make a body when you cast a body.
Yeah, I agree. That would be good. I mean, in mono white, it's a really solid spell anyway, most of the time.
Yeah.
Being able to get that extra cost reduction and make bodies that you can then target with, Oblation, for example, to draw cards. Or Path to Exile to ramp and then recast a path that, if you need to from a graveyard later on. The extra utility that gives you is pretty useful. So yeah, I like that one as a suggestion as well. So let's jump over and take a look at the enchantments. That one's pretty easy. Land tax we already mentioned. We mentioned monologue tax in the place of Smothering Tithe, just to kind of keep from running Smothering Tithe, which I get. There's Out of Time, which was from Modern Horizons 2. It's 3 mana, 1 white for an enchantment. When it ETBs, untap all creatures and then phase them out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. And you put a time counter on it for each creature phased out this way, and it has Vanishing. So then at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter from the enchantment, and when the last one is removed, you sacrifice it and those creatures all come back. Realistically, probably not going to ever vanish. I mean, you're going to cast this and you're going to get rid of, very frequently. Like, how often is Blasphemous Act ever anything less than maybe, 2 or 3 mana? This is always going to come into play with 5 or 6 time counters on it, if not 10 or 12 or 14 or something. It's just never going to go away unless somebody intentionally removes it. That said, I think it's a neat card if you are playing something that cares about enchantments or cares about, white pips on devotion or something. I feel like, though, it's just a Wrath of God with extra steps in a lot of ways. What do you think?
I think it's awesome.
Okay.
Mainly because Justin kind of mentioned that this is a deck where you got to be patient. You got to wait to essentially get your strike in on an opponent. To, I think this is one of those decks where, you don't sandbag, but based on how the deck is built, you are moving much slower than the rest of the table. So
yes.
Casting this card, casting Out of Time, and maybe, exiling a couple of your little 1/1 dudes that aren't your commander, but exiling 8 other creatures off the battlefield or more, putting 10 counters on this, and you lost 2 things of that, I think that's great.
It does get around indestructible kind of things as well, because it's vanishing, or it phases them out, So it does work around that, which makes a difference over compared to something like Wrath of God for sure.
Yeah.
And there are situations where you can, do things like remove it when it's strategically advantageous for you to do so. Or, you cast this and phase things out that are useful to have for you to have them gone temporarily too. Like there's definitely tricks you can do with this in a way you can't with like a plain old board wipe. So there are definitely things you can do.
My first and only suggestion for the enchantments is Cathar's Crusade.
Yeah. It's a win condition.
It's a win condition. Yeah, the math gets long after a while, but when all your creatures are, 1/1s, 2/2s, and 3/3s, making that token off of Field of Dead puts a counter on all of them.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I lied. I actually have other suggestions. That was just my first suggestion.
I have one more I'll throw out here. Myth Realized. It's a 1 white mana for an enchantment. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a lore counter on it. You can spend 2 and a white to put a lore counter on it, although I don't know how often you'll do that other than maybe as a mana sink at the end of the turn before yours or something. However, it has a single white activated ability. It says until end of turn, Myth Realized becomes a monk avatar creature in addition to its other types and gains this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of lore counters on it. This is a spell that you can drop turn 1 or 2 or something because it costs a single white mana and start doing your things, and magically by turn 8 or 9, you're going to have a dozen lore counters on it. It's going to survive through the vast majority of board wipes, and all of a sudden you've got a 12/12 that you can swing at somebody with for a single white mana. The problem with these kind of decks, and we talked about this, we did an EDH Recast show actually recently, we talked about the concept of too much of a good thing, and one of the things I mentioned there was, in my Talran deck, for example, there's, things like Biting to Thassa or Coastal Piracy, where like when I deal combat damage to a player, I draw a card. Those are really good spells in that kind of deck, because Talran makes drakes and it goes wide, and I can very often hit somebody with 6 different creatures simultaneously and draw 6 cards. That's amazing. However, the entire deck is built around instants of sorceries, and I don't want too many enchantments that don't do anything with Talran in that deck. I haven't maybe hit the threshold of those kind of Biden to Thassa effects yet, but at some point I'm going to. There's just only so many enchantments I want to run in that deck before I get to this weird balance where it's too many. The same thing is true here a little bit. We mentioned a few different artifacts, and we're talking about a few enchantments now. Those are things that don't interact with Mavinda, so I understand that you don't want to go put too many of those things in there, or suddenly you're down to 22 instances of sorcery spells, which makes it much more difficult for that deck to function. However, I think Myth Realized is so efficient, and there's just going to be those situations where somebody board wipes, including you perhaps, and all of a sudden there's no creatures in play, and you're able to spend a single white mana and turn that into a 16/16 and maybe kill somebody. This is, I just think, a perfect deck for it, and I would consider finding room for that card.
Yeah, that is a great card. My other suggestions, again, kind of playing to the fact that this is, you have to be very patient to play this deck. So stuff like Ghostly Prison that make people not want to attack you, are stuff like Blind Obedience or Authority of the Consuls that slow your opponents down by bringing their stuff in tapped. Just might help you make it towards the late game and maybe even help hang in with those maybe higher power decks you're playing against.
Yeah. Being able to buy yourself the time you need to get to the point where you need to turn that corner is very important. And that stuff will be very useful for that as well. Yeah, agreed. What should we look at next year, Max?
Let's head over to the Sorceries.
All right.
There are 5 of them. We have an Austere Command, Launch the Fleet, McKindy Stampede. This is one of the other MDFCs in the deck. This lets creatures get +2/+2 until end of turn for 3 double white. We have Shoulder to Shoulder, which is a sorcery from Battle Bond for 2 and a white. Support 2 and draw a card, and good old Wrath of God.
So that's a pretty simple breakdown of sorceries here. We have a couple of board wipes, one of the kind of win conditions and Launch the Fleet that lets you go wide and makes a bunch of tokens. Candy Stampede is basically Overcome in white, although I guess there's no trample on it, but creatures you control get +2/+2. Very, very useful. And yeah, same thing. Shoulder to Shoulder. This is a way to buff your creatures and replace itself and draw a card, and then you can cast from the graveyard and do it again. I think all of these things that give a effect that then draw a card are really, really good in this deck. Kind of plays a bit like Feather, where some of your card draw is going to be being able to use these spells multiple times.
Yeah.
So what do you have here for suggestions, maybe, Max?
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of the McKindy Stampede. I understand you can recast it, but it doesn't target, so you're going to end up paying 8 more for it.
Yes.
So I would rather see this be something like Dictate a Heliod, which is the enchantment with flash that does the same thing for the same amount of mana. You just don't get to cast it from your graveyard. I would like to see Dusk to Dawn here. So Dusk is 2 white, destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. You can kind of manipulate this so some of your stuff probably survives. But more importantly, the Dawn half says, return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. This hits 14 creatures in the deck, including the commander. So you don't need to worry about Mavinda being out to cast the Aftermath part because it just needs to be in your graveyard.
Right.
So I definitely think this is something to consider. Again, the fact that you have to be more patient with this deck, I think you can add 1 or 2 more board wipes and still not be that annoying board wipe player.
Yeah, I think you could as well. I didn't have a ton of suggestions here. The one that jumped out at me was maybe Savin's Reclamation. It's just so efficient. It doesn't target your own things, but you don't need to in order to use it with the Mavinda ability. But if you don't need to because it has flashback, and there's a lot of spells in this deck, a lot of permanents, creatures in particular, that you can just bring back into play with it. So that's one to consider. I don't know if this is a perfect deck for it. I'm running it in my Arden and Essior deck because almost every equipment I have in that deck is 3 mana or less. So like being able to bring back a Sword of Light and Shadow or something after someone blows it up is really, really useful. Is it that important in this deck to bring back, your Fabled Hero or something? I don't know. That's a deck where like literally every piece of equipment is pretty good. Is the Phalanx Leader here nearly as impactful as me bringing back a Nettle Sith that's going to give a creature +12/+12? I don't know if it is here, but it's still a pretty decent card and maybe worth considering. It's one of those few ways to get pretty decent card advantage in the form of recursion in white. So yeah, it's one to look at, I think.
Awesome.
Let's just jump into it and bite the bullet and talk about the instance.
The 31 instance, everybody.
Yeah. Chroma's Will. So that's the equivalent of
winning the game.
Overwhelming Stampede. Yep, it's your white overrun. I mean, it doesn't interact with Mavinda. You can't reuse it because it doesn't target it, but who cares? One use out of it is plenty. Absolutely running it. You should run it in this deck. Just perfect spot for it. Artful Maneuver. Target creature gets +2/+2 till end of turn, and it has Rebound. So you can get multiple uses out of that. Bandage prevents 1 damage to any creature or player, which is terrible, but you draw a card off it. So this is a thing where functionally this is going to wind up being spend a mana, draw a card, go to your graveyard, spend a second mana to draw a card. In this deck, if Mavinda's out, it's a better Night's Whisper.
Right, and I'm guessing a lot of these older prevent damage cards from like Stronghold and prior, they've been eroded to say target, because I know Bandage at least has. So yep. We're going to go on that assumption, everybody.
So yeah, I mean, those kind of things in this deck are going to wind up being really effective draw spells. That one is especially.
Yep.
Bathe in the Light, 1 and a white. It has Radiance, and you choose a color, and target creature and each other creature that shares a color with it gains protection from the color of choice till end of turn. Really good defensive spell in this deck, and it's recurable. Blacksmith Skill, target permanent gains hexproof and indestructible till end of turn, and if it's an artifact creature, it gets +2/+2. I mean, you don't care. This is just something you're going to be able to cast and recast at instant speed on someone else's turn if you need to save your stuff.
Yeah.
Karum, or is it Karum? I think it's Karum. 1 and a white. The next 1 damage that will be dealt to target creature this turn is dealt to another target creature instead. Again, it's a better Night's Whisper almost. I guess not necessarily better because it costs 1 and a white versus just a white, but I mean, it's a draw spell that's going to let you sometimes kill something, or at the very least take less damage or save one of your things from getting killed. So yeah, good spot to recur in this deck in particular. Crib Swap. It's a tribal instant shapeshifter for 2 and a white. It has every creature type, so that's sometimes relevant if you're fetching things or doing things that care about creature types. But more importantly, it just exiles target creature and its controller creates a 1/1 shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. So it's just an easily recurable thing. If you need to hit somebody else's with it, or if you, for some reason, want to get rid of your own thing, you can get a 1/1 colorless shapeshifter if you want to. Dawn Charm, it's a fog. Probably more importantly in this deck, you can regenerate target creature, so it's a way to save one of your things and then have it available in the graveyard to save a thing again. Defiant Strike, target creature gets +1/+0 to end of turn and you draw a card for a single white. This is one of those better Night's Whispers in this spell. Emerge Unscathed, single white, target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice to end of turn and it has Rebound. So multiple uses out of that. Ephemeral Shields, 1 and a white, target creature gains indestructible to end of turn. And it's an instant, and it has Convoke as well, so you can tap 1 creature to make it a single white. Very, very useful in a lot of situations. Ephemerate, exile a creature you control, then return it to the battlefield, so it's a blink effect. It has Rebound, and you can also reuse it as well. A lot of value in this deck in particular. Generous Gift, which is just the white Beast Within. However, in this deck, you have the option to, hit one of your own things and turn that 1/1 token into a 3/3 token or something. So is offensive use of this beyond just removing your opponent's thing. Guided Strike, 1 and a white, target creature gains +1/+0 to end a turn, and first strike, and then you draw a card. So it winds up being a 4-mana draw 2, but giving your creature +2/+0 and first strike isn't bad, while you're also drawing 2 cards. Heal, prevent 1 damage to any target creature or player, and then draw a card at the beginning of next turn's upkeep. Better Knight's Whisper. Kai's Onslaught, 2 and a white, target creature gains +1/+1, and double strike till end of turn. It also has Foretell, but just being able to use it multiple times to give creatures double strike and +1/+1 is very, very good. Niveus Wasps, for a single white, target creature becomes white, and you tap it and draw a card. Fantastic. Oblation, 2 and a white, target creature is shuffled into its owner's library, and then they draw 2 cards. So it's an emergency removal spell, and in plenty of situations, you're just going to hit your own token and draw 2 cards, and then probably do it again. Path to Exile, great removal spell. The fact that you can use it twice here probably means there's situations where it'll get cast on your own creature to ramp, and then get cast from the graveyard on whatever the problem is. Pressure Point, 1 and a white, tap target creature, draw a card. The tap is very useful. To draw a card is even better when you reuse it. Pull from Eternity, put target face-up card that's removed from the game into its owner's graveyard. So things that get exiled with Mavinda, you can bring that card back with Pull from Eternity, and then recast it and bring something else back. Sajiri's Shelter, target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice to end a turn for 1 and a white. Very usable, very good. Shelter, 1 and a white, target creature gains protection from the color of your choice, and you draw a card. So, again, a lot of these really efficient effects with a draw card stapled on the end.
I was going to say, we've said draw a card a lot for a mono white deck.
Absolutely. And normally it's not like running those bad effects just to draw a card isn't particularly useful, unless you can cast that same spell a second time from your graveyard, and suddenly a lot of these things look way, way better. Show of Confidence, 1 and a white. Whenever you cast a spell, copy it for each other instant or sorcery spell you've cast this turn. Put a +1 counter on target creature, and it gains Vigilance till end of turn. I mean, a lot of times that's just going to be a 2-mana, and you're going to be able to put multiple counters on things. That's pretty solid. Spiritualize is another one of those draw a card at the end effects, but whenever a creature deals damage until end of turn, you gain that much life. Study Break, 1 and a white, and you can tap 2 creatures, and you can also learn off of that. Swords to Plowshares, exile a creature, its power gains life equal to its controller gains life equal to its power. Very good, and might get used on your own stuff once in a while. Teferi's Protection just saves your butt. Topple the statue, 2 and a white, and you can tap target permanent. And if it's an artifact, destroy it. Very solid, and again, it draws a card, so you're going to be casting that one twice for the card draw. Valorous Stance, 1 and a white, and you can choose one. Target creature gains indestructible, or you destroy a creature with toughness 4 or greater. So you're going to probably oftentimes use this to destroy a creature, goes in your graveyard, and then you're going to use it from there to make your stuff indestructible. Last but not least, Withstand, 2 and a white, and prevent the next 3 damage that will be dealt target creature or player this turn, and you draw a card. So even more draw on really efficient white spells. Did you have anything to add here, Max?
I have one, and of course it's a board wipe.
Okay.
And that would be Settle the Wreckage. Attacking target player, attacking creatures get exiled, and then they go get basic lands for every creature exiled. You could use this on yourself if you really wanted to. Or, if it saves you, if it buys you that 1 turn from an Alpha Strike, it's definitely worth slotting in here for 4 mana. So
I have one I'm going to put out here as a suggestion. Kind of one of those, it'll be a win con, I guess, in this deck. Call the Coppercoats is a really good card. It was from back in Commander 2020. It's 2 and a white. Choose any number of target opponents and create X 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, where X is the number of creatures those opponents control. And it has Strive for 1 and a white. So 3 mana, you're going to make 3 or 4 creatures if somebody has 3 or 4 creatures, and then you're going to spend an additional 2 and make 3 or 4 more. It's almost always going to be really efficient. There's going to be times, however, when it's going to make you a dozen tokens or more sometimes. And yeah, you can't recast it cheaply from your graveyard with Mavinda, but there's still going to be times when you're like, well, I'll pay the extra 8 because 11 mana to make a dozen tokens is going to be enough to buy you time, if not win the game, because it's instant speed. So like if somebody is doing something and they think you aren't a threat, being able to call the Coppercoats at instant speed is going to do a lot of good sometimes. And you recommended Cathar's Crusade, Max. Before the end of someone's turn, you call the Coppercoats with Cathar's Crusade out, drop 6 bodies or something, all which get counters, untap on your turn, spend the extra 8 mana to recast Call the Coppercoats, just to proc the Cathar's Crusade numbers and put another, half a dozen or 8 counters on your creatures and kill somebody. There's a bunch of scenarios where in this kind of deck, even though it doesn't really interact with Mavinda, Cult of Coppercoats is probably going to be a way to kill people sometimes. And I think it's definitely one that I would consider running as just like a backup win condition.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea.
Any more instance from you here?
That was all I had. I think what this deck is trying to do, we want all these one-off effects, and I'm sure there are thousands more of these that all do very similar things and all draw a card, so I'm just sure these are the ones he wants to run.
This is the spot I felt like where the deck was the most fully developed. The instants and the creatures felt like it was the toughest to find anything for, because all the things I would think of or I looked up felt like they were already in here. Like that's where the time kind of sculpting this and tweaking it has really gone, is these 2 categories. Well, since we've said that, I guess, why don't we jump over and look at the creatures, Max? What do we have?
We have 21 creatures. We have a Crow and Skyguard. This is a 1/1 flyer for 1 and a white. It has Heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets a Crow and Skyguard, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Cavalier Dawn is 2 triple white for a 4/6 with Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. Its controller makes a 3/3 Golem artifact creature token. When it dies, return target artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. We have Cemetery Protector, one of the new cards from Crimson Vow. It has Flash. It's 2 and 2 white for a 3/4 with Flash. When it enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. When you play a land card or cast a spell that shares a type with the exiled card, create a 1/1 human creature token. So you exile an instant you probably don't plan on recasting. Every instant you cast going forward makes you a body as long as this is out. Clarion Spirit, 1 and a white for a 2/2. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. Esper Sentinel, single white from Modern Horizons 2. It's a 1/1. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. Fabled Hero is 1 double white for a 2/2 double striker, and it has Heroic, and which means when you target it, when you cast a spell that targets it, put a +1/+1 counter on Fabled Hero. Mirror Entity is 2 and a white for a shapeshifter, and you can pay X. Until end of turn, creatures you control have base power XX and gain all creature types. Monastery Mentor, it's 2 and a white for a 2/2 monk. It has prowess, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a 1/1 monk creature token with prowess onto the battlefield. Myriad Construct is a 4-mana artifact. It has for a 4/4, and it has Kicker 3. If it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each non-basic land your opponents control, and when it becomes the target of a spell, sacrifice it and create a number of 1/1 colorless construct artifact creatures tokens equal to its power. So again, great pairing up with that Cathar's Crusade if that gets added in. Ojutai Exemplars, 2 double white for a 4/4 monk, and when you cast a non-creature spell, choose one of the following. You can tap a target creature, the Exemplars gain first strike and lifelink until end of turn, or exile the Exemplars and return them to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control. We have the Phalanx Leader. It's a double white 1/1 soldier with Heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Precursor Golem. It's a 3/3 for 5. When it enters the battlefield, put 2 3/3 colorless Golem artifact creature tokens onto the battlefield. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only a single Golem, that player copies that spell for each other Golem that spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those Golems. The math gets really crazy here, but it's fun.
Yes.
Reflective Golem is a 3-mana 2/3, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery that targets only Reflective Golem, you may pay 2. If you do, copy that spell and choose new targets. Skyclave Apparition is 1 double white for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-land, non-token permanent you don't control with CMC 4 or less. And then when it leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX blue illusion creature token where X is the converted mana cost of the exiled card. Sun Titan, just to recur a bunch of these creatures and the artifacts and enchantments, and I guess some of the cycling lands if we keep those in.
That's true. That's true. Good point.
Tethmos High Priest, 2 and a white for a 2/3. It has Heroic, and when you cast a spell that targets it, return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Thalia's Geist Caller is 2 and a white for a 3/1 with lifelink, and when you cast a spell from your graveyard, make a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying, and you can sacrifice a spirit to give Thalia's Geist Color indestructible until end of turn. We have Vanguard of Bramaz, which is double white for a 2/2 with Vigilance and Heroic, and when you cast a spell that targets it, put a 1/1 cat creature token with Vigilance onto the battlefield. We have Wandering Archaic. It's a double-sided card. The front side is the creature for 5 mana. It's a 4/4. Whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, they may pay 2. If they don't, you may copy the spell and choose new targets. And then the backside is Explore the Vast Lands. It's a 3-mana sorcery. Each player looks at the top 5 cards of their library, reveals a land and or an instant or sorcery card from among them, then puts the cards they revealed in this way into their hand and the rest on the bottom of their library in a random order, and each player gains 3 life. We have Weathered Wayfarer for a single white. It's a 1/1, and it has an activated ability of white and tap. Search your library for a land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Then shuffle your library. Play this ability only if an opponent controls more lands than you. And last but not least, Wing Steed Rider. It's a 3-mana, 1 double white, 2/2 flyer with Heroic, and you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it when the Heroic trigger goes off.
Okay.
I love seeing all the Heroic. I'll say
Yes.
that much.
Great use of Heroic, totally agree there as well. It was a mechanic that was fun to play in Limited and was never very good in Commander, and it's kind of nice to see a deck where it's way better than it is in most other situations for sure. Any particular creatures that jump out at you, Max, that you'd like to add to this deck that aren't here already?
So the one I originally thought of was Mangara the Diplomat. Again, kind of playing in that hole, this is kind of a slower deck, and this is the one where someone attacks you with 2 or more creatures, you draw a card. And I think if they cast a second non-creature spell, you draw a card.
Mm-hmm.
So just more card drawing, more stuff to put in your graveyard if you have too many cards. So I think it definitely is worth it. And it's 2 power, so you could bring it back with Dusk.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at this deck and I'm like, okay, so what creatures do I want to run here? I'm like, I feel like something like, obviously, Skyclave Apparition would be pretty good, and Sun Titan, like, they're both in here. Or, Weather Wayfarer, I think you want to run some efficient, that's in here. Ojai Exemplar, so that's it. Like, every one I thought about looking up. Esper Sentinel, obviously, particularly in a mono white deck. Literally, I looked up 10 different creatures, or thought of 10 different creatures off the top of my head, and every one I looked at was in here. Mirror Entity is in here. Monastery Mentor is in here. Like, they were just all in here. So yeah, I literally had no creatures that I could think of here that I would have recommended for this deck that weren't already in the deck.
Same. And especially because, the heroic stuff plays in, especially because these are single target spells. So you want these little, essentially unthreatening 1/1s and 2/2s until you start your engine going. And, you just heroic and you make a spirit because that's something else had prowess. And I can definitely see how this is like almost like a Rube Goldberg machine where it just starts snowballing until you win the game.
Yes. Yeah. We mentioned that the instants were pretty well formed. I think the creature suite here is too. Like these last 2 categories were by far the most difficult for me to come up with suggestions for, because this is just, it seems to be where the deck has been most thoroughly tweaked, I think for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so what are your final thoughts here, Max, before we wrap this up? Are you a fan of them? Have you seen a Mavinda deck before or played against one at all?
I have not seen a Mavinda deck before. I've never played against one. I think this is super cool. I think it's taking that probably not very often played commander and doing what it wants you to do and finding a really cool way to do it without needing to put it in a multicolor deck and have to go search for all the pieces.
Yeah, like my first thought is it's basically going to look like a mono white Feather the Redeemed deck. And it does a little bit, but not that much. I think there's just enough stuff in Boros or at least having access to red that you run in that Feather deck that you obviously can't run here. And being forced to go into mono white, changes up quite a bit what the deck construction is and the pieces you have to run that you wouldn't otherwise run in that Feather deck. I'm surprised, yes. I've never played against one before either, but this makes for quite an interesting deck, and it's a good exercise, I think. I like seeing things where people have had to think outside the box to make a particular commander function. So yeah, no, kudos to Justin here. I like this deck a lot. It's an interesting build of an interesting commander. That's probably going to be an interesting play experience. All things that you want to try to accomplish, or at least that I want to try to accomplish when I brew a list. So I like it a lot.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Justin, for sharing this with us, and thanks to all our supporters out there. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving if you were in the U.S., and hope you had just a great weekend if you're not. We will be back next week with a new show. I am Dana. You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max, and you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons, and our show is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find them on the Twitter birds at Ursa Bearwalker. Until next week, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.